The open ocean was an unforgiving place, but for sailors who stepped out of line, the real danger wasn't just the crashing waves or enemy cannon fire, it was their own shipmates. Discipline aboard a ship during the age of sail was harsh, merciless, and often deadly. From the bone-cracking Gauntlet to the gruesome and torturous keelhauling, these methods of punishment were as cruel as they were effective. Today, we're looking at the most brutal ways sailors were punished at sea. Oftentimes, the worst crime a sailor could commit wasn't theft, violence, or desertion. It was simply opening his mouth at the wrong time. A sailor who talked back, cursed an officer, or became too rowdy could find himself gagged, a punishment designed to humiliate and silence him in the most degrading way possible. The process was simple but effective. The sailor's hands and legs were bound, and an iron bolt, wooden gag, or even a chunk of cannonball was forced into his mouth and tied behind his head. He would then be left like that for hours, unable to speak, drink, or even swallow his own saliva. While gagging was never an official punishment in the British Royal Navy, it was widely used, despite the very real danger it posed. One tragic case was that of George Addison, a sailor aboard HMS Favourite in 1867. After getting drunk and violent, Addison was gagged as punishment, but he never recovered. Within 2 hours, he was dead from asphyxiation. When a sailor was accused of disobedience, insubordination, or petty crimes, he could expect flogging, the most common form of punishment on board a ship. A common weapon of choice was the cat-o'-nine-tails. This savage whip had 9 leather strands, often tipped with knots, musket balls, or even fish hooks, to tear through flesh with every strike. The number of lashes varied depending on the crime, but the infamous Moses' Law, a limit of 39 lashes, was believed to be the most a man could survive. In reality, some men endured over 100 lashes, while others died after just a few. Flogging wasn't just unimaginably painful, it could be deadly. Since the whip was rarely cleaned, it would be caked with the blood, flesh, and filth of previous victims. Infection was extremely common, and many sailors died from gangrene and sepsis long after the punishment was over. One of the worst aspects of flogging was the psychological terror it inflicted. Every sailor knew that at any moment he could be called to the deck, tied to the grating, and whipped until his back was a mass of torn flesh and exposed muscle. A naval variation of running the gauntlet was historically practiced in the Royal Navy, typically reserved for minor infractions, such as leaving crew quarters in an unsanitary condition or returning late from shore leave. The condemned sailor was forced to complete a set number of laps around the ship's deck, while being struck by his shipmates, who used makeshift versions of the cat-o'-nine-tails to deliver the blows. In some cases, the punishment was made even more excruciating by preceding it with a dozen lashes from the boatswain's cat-o'-nine-tails. This meant that every additional strike from the crew would land on already open wounds, intensifying the agony. The severity of the punishment often depended on how well-liked the sailor was and the seriousness of his offense. A notable example occurred in 1760 aboard HMS Royal George, when seaman Francis Lanyon was sentenced to 3 runs of the gauntlet for failing to return from leave. However, the crew disapproved of the punishment, and the ship's lieutenant later recorded that Lanyon emerged with little to no significant injuries, suggesting that his shipmates had intentionally gone easy on him. The practice of running the Gauntlet in the Royal Navy was officially abolished by Admiralty order in 1806, but that didn't stop some captains from continuing to use it anyway. For more serious crimes, captains had a punishment that was both cruel and poetic: marooning. The offender was taken to a remote island, left with nothing but a small keg of water and a single pistol. Sometimes they were even stripped naked, forced to face the elements, starvation and madness completely alone. In some cases, sailors were set adrift in a tiny boat, given no oars or just a single paddle, left to drift aimlessly until they died of thirst or exposure. The most famous maroon sailor was Alexander Selkirk, abandoned on the Juan Fernandez Islands off the coast of Chile in 1704. He survived for 4 years before being rescued, and his story inspired Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. But most marooned men weren't so lucky. Some begged for a swift end immediately, rather than endure a slow, lonely death. Others used the tools they were given to accelerate the inevitable before starvation or insanity set in. Keelhauling was arguably the most gruesome punishment of the entire age of sail. Though the Royal Navy never officially endorsed it due to its horrific cruelty, it was still practiced in various instances before being formally outlawed around 1720. The condemned sailor was stripped naked and bound with 2 ropes, one running under the ship's keel and another held by the crew. He was then dropped over the side, dragged beneath the ship, and hauled across the barnacle-encrusted hull before emerging on the opposite side. This punishment could be performed as slowly or as many times as the officers in charge desired. To ensure maximum suffering, a weight was attached to the sailor's legs, keeping him aligned with the ship's underside. Drowning was a frequent outcome, but for those who survived, a far worse fate awaited them. The ship's hull was often covered in razor-sharp barnacles, which would rip through flesh like a jagged blade. The result was severe lacerations, shredded muscle, and lasting disfigurement, if infection or blood loss didn't finish the job first. Those unlucky enough to survive keel hauling were left with permanent scars, both physical and psychological. No pirate story is complete without the image of a sailor being forced to walk the plank. But was this actually a real punishment? The concept of walking the plank has an unusual and murky history. One of the earliest references comes from the 1724 General History of the Pirates, a source known for its questionable accuracy. It claims that Roman-era pirates forced victims to climb ladders extending into the ocean, an early precursor to the idea of walking the plank. While this account is likely fictional, it marks the first known mention of such a practice. The first recorded instance of walking the plank occurred in the 1760s, involving a mutineer named George Wood. Before his execution in 1769, Wood allegedly confessed to forcing officers to walk the plank. However, this claim is almost certainly fabricated, as Wood wasn't a pirate and likely exaggerated his exploits to enhance his notoriety. There are also unverified accounts of slavers employing this method, but these claims remain unsubstantiated. The term walking the plank was first documented in 1788 in the Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue, which described it as something mutineers did, referencing Wood's tale rather than pirate tradition. It wasn't until the 1800s that walking the plank became an iconic element of pirate lore, with actual reports emerging. In July 1822, William Smith, captain of the British sloop Blessing, was forced by Spanish pirates to walk the plank in the West Indies. On February 14, 1829, the Times of London reported that the packet Redpole was captured by the pirate schooner President, during which the commander was shot and the crew forced to walk the plank. Later that year, pirates attacked the Dutch brig Van Frederica near the Virgin Islands, compelling most of the crew to walk the plank with cannonballs tied to their feet, ensuring a swift descent into the depths. The myth gained further traction with the 1837 publication of The Pirate's Own Book, which popularized the imagery of plank-walking pirates. Author Charles Elmes depicted the act vividly, and from there it made its way into Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, where Billy Bones famously references it. Howard Pyle's illustrations of pirates forcing men to walk the plank also cemented it in popular culture. In reality, walking the plank was far less common than stories suggest. Historians argue that most recorded incidents occurred after the legend had been established, illustrating how literature and myth can shape real-world actions. In this case, fiction may have inspired the very crime it depicted, adding another layer of intrigue to pirate lore. Life at sea was a brutal existence, and the punishments were often far worse than the crimes themselves. Whether it was the agonizing lash of the cat-o'-nine-tails, the slow death of marooning, or the nightmare of keel-hauling, sailors had to constantly live in fear of their superiors. If you've made it this far, please do consider subscribing to the channel for more historical tales of mystery and brutality. Thank you so much for watching, stay curious, and we'll see you on the next one.